your experts. A brief introduction of the National School of Public Policy. The National School of Public Policy is the premier training institute for training and continuing education of civil servants here in Pakistan. It provides mandatory multi-tiered policy courses for civil servants throughout their career, going up to the level of BPS 20. This was established in its current form in March 2005. And training is the main focus, but it's also now putting equal emphasis on executive education and policy dialogue through the Executive Development Institute, which is the current platform wing of the NSPP that we are talking to you from at the moment. Here we hold policy dialogues, we conduct short training courses, webinars, distinguished speaker series. We try to bring together people, professionals from the public sector, the private sector, the civil society, including academia. The idea is that as part of civil service reform and governance reform, in the 21st century, it is not just the public sector alone, but also the input from these other sectors of the society, which is very important in the formulation of public policy and also in governance. So that gives us a 360-degree view of all issues and leading to exchange of experiences and information. And part of what we're doing today is, of course, taking that to the international level of the exchange of experiences. And we're very fortunate, like I said, to have such two distinguished speakers with us today, one from here, Pakistan, and the other from South Africa. So like you said, sir, our speaker would be focusing on, and along with Professor Laholi, on the civil service reforms and change management for effective service delivery and professionalism in services. Your speaker will be sharing the lessons learned from South Africa, and Dr. Ishrat Sensab, based on his extensive and vast career and experience, would be talking about his experience from Pakistan. Just to put in context, the civil service reforms, as you mentioned very ably, and you just mentioned, the reforms that are going on and the cabinet approval. So of the various functions of the state, perhaps the one that is most effective for the topic we have today of service delivery is the function of the state of provision of goods and services. And that, I understand, is what South African government bureaucracy and what the Pakistani bureaucracy is also emphasizing upon. One of the important things here in all this is how the people view bureaucracy. So that has to be one of the touchstones, because at the end of the day, the government in any democracy is government of the people, for the people, by the people. So it is the view of the public which is extremely important of how they look at the bureaucracy. Do they see it as a regulatory, enabling, or stifling? Is the bureaucracy facilitative or controlling? As you mentioned, sir, the Chinese example and the Indian example. So the reform has to be looked at in this background. So how much embedded is the bureaucracy within the broader society? What is the focus of reforms? Upper bureaucracy, low bureaucracy, or what we call the street level bureaucracy? What is the balance between improvement of service structure or improvement in service delivery? Is it process-oriented or output-focused, piecemeal or holistic? And Dr. Ishrat Sen would be talking, I'm sure, more about it. And he was just discussing with us before the official start of this, that, the various options of going for piecemeal or holistic reforms. So, and we all have to keep in mind the evolving function of government. Government over the centuries has totally changed. The issue is, when we talk about civil service reforms, have the bureaucracies, have the civil service accordingly changed to perform those functions? The function of the government in the 19th century was totally different. The function of the government in the 21st century is almost that of a welfare state, or what we sometimes call a nanny state. That has become totally different. The focus is social services now. How much is the reform being carried out? How much is the professionalism of the civil services geared towards that? So whenever we look at the gaps or reforms in any setup, in any discipline, I think you look at the current structure, you identify the gaps, you see what steps have been taken to fill those gaps, you assess how successful those steps have been, and why there are still gaps, and what are those gaps. So for that, we would, of course, be looking towards the two experts to share the experiences of Pakistan and South Africa. In Pakistan, civil service reforms have been happening over the decades. In 1962, then major reforms happened in 1973. They have all been dealing with the various structures of bureaucracy, with these social service provision by the bureaucracy. Then we had a devolution plan, which devolved power to the sub-provincial level, the district, sub-district levels. And then, of course, in the last two reforms, the National Commission on Governance Reform and the latest reform, we're very fortunate that we have our speaker who was involved in spearheading in both those reforms. So I will not go into that. I will leave that for Dr. Ishrata Sen Saab to speak on that. So with that background, may I now request Dr. Ishrata Sen Saab to please share his views. By way of introduction, although Dr. Saab needs no introduction, he's an internationally and nationally a very well-known person. Dr. Saab has served as former advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on institutional reforms and austerity. During 2016 and 17, he was the Public Policy Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and he produced his latest book, Governing the Ungovernable. He's the Higher Education Commission National Distinguished Professor. He's the Professor Emeritus and Chairman, Center for Excellence in Islamic Finance at the Institute of Business Administration, which is a very well-known educational institution here in Pakistan at Karachi, where he served as Dean and Director between 2008 and 2016. He transformed it into a leading global business school. He has also been Chairman of the National Commission for Government Reforms from 2006 to 2008, and he produced a 2-volume report on governance reforms in Pakistan. He was appointed Governor of Pakistan Central Bank in December 1999. He was confirmed the Halal-e-Imtiaz by the President of Pakistan in 2003, and the Banker magazine of London declared him as the Central Bank Governor of the Year for Asia in 2005. He received the Asian Banker Lifetime Achievement Award in 2006 and was conferred the highest civilian award of Nishan-e-Imtiaz in 2016. Dr. Hussain has worked in the World Bank from 1979 to 1999. His book titled Pakistan, The Economy of the Elitist State is widely read in Pakistan and outside. His latest research and writings are focused on CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and his book, CPEC and Pakistan Economy, has been published by the Center for Excellence on CPEC in 2018. Dr. Saab is regularly invited as a speaker to international conferences and seminars and has attended more than 100 such events all over the world. He obtained his master's degree in development economics from Williams College and doctorate in economics from Boston University in 1978, and is a graduate of the Executive Development Program jointly sponsored by Harvard, Stanford, and INSAD. With that, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Mr. Principal of National School of Government, Mr. Rector of the National School of Public Policy, directors, faculty members, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here participating in this webinar. And I'm particularly pleased that this is actually a follow-up of an earlier international webinar in which I participated along with several experts. And I was very much hopeful that this would be a continuous effort on part of both South Africa and Pakistan to learn from each other's experiences. And what the principal today showed me and the 5 pillars, I was really very pleasantly amazed that they are similar to what we were doing in Pakistan, and which is the process underway. So this is a point of convergence between the efforts we are making. So today, let me attempt to answer 4 questions, which would be very important for the policymakers, for the academics, as well as for the public opinion makers. Why reform? If the system ain't broke, why fix it? What is the rationale and justification for this? The second question I want to answer is, what has been the approach of the civil service reforms in Pakistan? The third question I would like to address is, what has been accomplished so far and what is outstanding agenda. And finally, this is very important, and I hope that my colleagues in South Africa keep in mind that designing the reform package is not so difficult as getting it implemented because of the political economy constraints in the implementation. And I would like to share in some depth the reasons why these constraints are a hindrance in implementation, otherwise benign civil service reforms. The need for reforms arises in the context of the present malaise and weakness of our governance structure, long-term vision of Pakistan, the external environment in which Pakistan will be operating as a country, the diagnostic studies, including public opinion polls about the performance of the government, reports of the various commissions and committees, and the growing gap between the rising expectations of the citizens and the capability of the state institutions to deliver. I would not go into the external environment and other issues because South Africa and Pakistan both face the same environment, so I won't spend much time because that will be repetition. But I would like to start with Kishore Mehbubani's question, which is, what is the role of the government? And this has been analyzed at great length, both by academics, but also by practitioners. And let me give you my own bias. From the literature and from the experience of the East Asian countries, as well as that of China, my view is that this binary postulate of government versus market is totally flawed and misplaced. Governments should do what they are capable of doing better than in the past. A strong and effective government is needed rather than a weak and expansive government. The all-wide encompassing government has become too cumbersome, too centralized, with overlapping and competing interests, inefficient and unresponsive to the emerging needs of the general public. Therefore, the role of the government is to provide an enabling environment for private businesses and farmers and other sectors so that they can carry out production, distribution, trade of goods and services, but not indulge itself in these activities directly. A successful enabling environment requires an efficient and a competent civil service, investment in human resources, skills, well-functioning physical infrastructure, rules of law, and equitable distribution of benefits of growth. Having established the role of the government, I want to emphasize that the buzzword today is that of sustainable and equitable development. And there is a strong correlation between good governance and sustainable and equitable development. However good policies may be, they will have little positive impact unless the institutions implementing them are effective and efficient. One of the main institutions required for good governance is a competent, neutral, honest bureaucracy. For ordinary citizens, it is the civil servants who are most germane to their daily life. Pakistan was fortunate to have inherited a steel frame for its bureaucracy from the British. Initially, the services remained true to their tradition and were governed by the hallmarks that had distinguished the Indian civil service. And let me repeat these hallmarks, which I think are common in South Africa also. A, constitutional protection to the civil servants. B, political neutrality. C, permanency. D, security of tenure. E, anonymity. And F, recruitment based on open competition and merit. And finally, rigorous post-induction training. In the period following independence, the civil servants focused on the routine functions of maintaining law and order and collecting revenue. But they also were instrumental in establishing the basic structure and the edifice of institutions like the State Bank of Pakistan, Auditor General of Pakistan, Planning Commission, and the Central Board of Revenue. However, with the passage of time, the requirements of a newly independent country went beyond the narrow set of functions which their predecessors used to perform. Pakistan's civil services system and processes did not adapt to changed circumstances. Their attitudes toward the citizens of an independent country, whom they were purported to serve, remain ingrained in paternalism of the past. They remained frozen in time and were unresponsive to the people's needs and aspirations. So the first set of reforms which took place in 1971 with a popularly elected government was to break the frame of the civil services and make them more pliable and flexible. The first hallmark of constitutional protection responsible for the civil servants' independence and neutrality was withdrawn. The quasi-monopoly of the civil services of Pakistan in appointment and allocation of top positions was demolished. All different cadres were brought at par and unified under a common pay scale, recruitment, and training. Compression ratio, the salary of the highest grade to the salary of lowest grade, was drastically cut down to great disadvantage of the officers' cadre. Unfortunately, these reforms did not address the larger question of the delivery of public services to the population at large. Except for a couple of thousand officers recruited by the Central Superior Services, the majority of civil servants remained confined to ex-cadre or non-cadre jobs, and several thousand doctors, educationists, teachers, scientists, engineers, lawyers, financial analysts, economists, and accountants in the public sector enjoy limited opportunities for career progression. This antiquated system of primary interaction between the state and citizen took place through a low-paid, ill-equipped, poorly educated, rude functionaries such as the Patwari, Thanedar, and subdivisional officers enjoying enormous discretionary powers, and they remain entrenched along with rampant corruption, inefficiency, and poor governance. The bottom-heavy lopsided structure where unskilled and semi-skilled employees occupy 95% of the strength of the federal and provincial governments and preempt 85% of the total salary bill has been a major factor in the poor compensation and benefits given to the managerial and technical experts in the officer grade for the government. So the resultant demotivation, demoralization, and despondency among the majority of the civil servants is reflected in the poor services delivery, indifference, inaction, and apathy towards clients, and a mindset resisting change in the process has become ingrained in their behavior. A system that recruits some of the very best talent and then allow them to be improperly used in outdated management practices, soaked in patronage and corruption, resulted in three kinds of responses. First, the best and the brightest, seeing the conditions of service and practices, decided not to appear at the civil service comparative examinations, thus impairing the quality of the new intakes. Another hallmark of an efficient civil service has disappeared. Second, honest and competent serving officers became frustrated, their job satisfaction is low, and either they exit the service or get themselves posted to less conspicuous or innocuous positions, thus lowering the quality of the decision making. Third, the survivors adjust to the new rules of game and lower their standards of honesty and engage in immoral administrative policies, continue to secure their own interest, caring two hoots for the service delivery or public welfare. They do suffer temporarily when the political party to whom they owe allegiance gets displaced and wait till the party is back to power. But I must also emphasize that it's not the structure alone which is responsible for this poor performance. The performance is also affected by outmoded rules and procedures, elongated hierarchy, absence of automation and computerization, ineffective incentive systems that do not appreciate outstanding civil servants, but equally reward the incompetent and corrupt. A more recent but harmful tendency that has emerged is obsessive controls exercised by the offices of the Prime Minister and the Chief Ministers, where all powers have been centralized and concentrated. Lack of trust in senior secretaries, second-guessing their judgment calls, looking for pliable and gullible civil servants who would toe their line, deprive the rendering of objective and unbiased advice. Those who do not toe the line are shown the door. As a direct consequence, merit and experience are disregarded and wrong people are placed in key jobs. The present mode of superior services that attract young men and women through an open comparative examination and spend 30 to 35 years serving the government had worked reasonably well in the first few decades after independence. The challenges of the 21st century for public service have become more complex. Therefore, the model of a short career path on the basis of one single entry examination at a young age is no longer applicable or sustainable any longer. A new hybrid model which nurtures, promotes, and draws upon the expertise and domain knowledge and combines it with the broad-based experience, leadership traits, and the ability to synthesize different perspectives and policy inputs is therefore proposed as a way forward. Leadership traits are not exclusively located with any one group, but can be found across the board. Having outlined the rationale and justification and the weaknesses of our system, the next question is, what are we going to do about it? And this leads us to spell out the objectives of the civil service reform, which have been actually approved by the cabinet last 2 years ago. What are these objectives? An open, transparent, merit-based recruitment to all levels and grades of public services, with regional representation as laid down in the Constitution. Second, performance-based promotions and career progression for all public sector employees, with compulsory training at post-induction, mid-career, and senior management levels. Third, equality of opportunities for career advancement to all employees without preferences or reservations for any particular class. Replacement of the concept of superior services by equality among all cadres and non-cadres, and without preferences or reservations for any cadres of the servants. So that is a homogenization of all the civil servants on the equal footing. Grant of a living wage and compensation package, including decent retirement benefits to all civil servants. A strict observance of security of tenure of office for a specified period of time. Separate cadres of regular civil services at the federal, provincial, and local government levels, coexisting with contractual appointments. Creation of an all-Pakistan National Executive Service for senior management positions drawn through a comparative process from among the federal, provincial, and local government cadres, ex-cadre and non-cadre officers, those working in autonomous bodies and other public sector entities. An introduction of 4 specialized cadres under the NES for economic management, technical, social sector management, and general management. But let me pause to say that all these objectives have not been approved. Some of them have been implemented and approved, but others, their modalities are still being discussed, and they are not really on the implementation stage. So what is that has happened? The whole approach, which I would like to commend the new system in South Africa, is that there should be a package of an integrated, interwoven value chain of human resource policies. It would be a mistake to just work on one component as a standalone without realizing the inseparable linkages with other parts of the chain. We are looking at how we can enhance the quality of human resources in the whole government. A weak link in the chain, if left to itself, would not allow that qualitative change to take place. So our value chain is similar to what the 5 pillars of South African framework are: recruitment, induction, then training, then performance management, career progression, promotion policy, compensation and benefits, and finally retirement. It must be emphasized that there has been a major change in the responsibilities of the federal and the provincial government. And the provincial governments now have more administrative and legal authority as compared to the federal government in the delivery of the public goods and services. And therefore, the importance of the provincial civil services has assumed a greater impact on the common citizens. I, for myself, argue that the devolution is incomplete unless we are empowering the local governments to strengthen the local bodies whose heads should be elected directly by the people and operate with the assistance of the civil servants. Rather than the low-level functionaries, actually you should have higher responsibility officers working with the local governments, because that's where the interaction between the government and the citizens take place. So I will not go into all the details, because in the earlier webinar, I had laid down what were the elements of these value chain, and you have adopted most of it, so it will be a repetition. But I want to emphasize something which I don't know is very much applicable to South Africa, but we have been having this kind of tension between the generalist and the specialist in Pakistan. And our take in the reform package is that we have to move towards a blended approach in which the relative strengths of the generalists and specialists are optimally utilized. At the time of induction, we should create incentives for candidates to match their preferences with some prior domain knowledge. There would be no restrictions of any academic qualification to apply and appear at the Central Service Examination. You may be a doctor or an engineer, but if you want to a career in the civil service, you must appear at international relations and international law as elective subjects. This will map up the preferences with the initial domain knowledge. Today, we have situations where we have English literature graduates who are doing, audit and accounts without understanding what a balance sheet really looks like. So we want to eliminate this disconnect and equip them right from the beginning. The other training aspect, which I want to emphasize in this context, is that there was no systematic training for the non-cadre and ex-cadre officers, which are 20,000 compared to 6,000 cadre officers. So we have requested the National School of Public Policy, which is one of our premier training institutions, to provide the standards of course content, examination systems, pedagogical tools, and the faculty control, so that these specialized training institutions are able to train the engineers, the doctors, and other specialists and bring them up to date. It is a pity that the last book they had read was when they were college, and the knowledge explosion which is taking place has escaped them. This is something which I feel will enhance the quality of our civil servants in very substantial way. The other point I wanted to just touch upon is that we are replacing, and this has been approved by the cabinet, the subjective evaluation reports by an objective-based KPI-driven evaluation system, which a subordinate can discuss with his or her superior officers, and both of them will agree and sign the KPIs that are to be achieved during the year. And only 20% in the cohort will be categorized as outstanding. And they will be compensated much higher than those who are average or satisfactory. And if an officer has not consistently performed satisfactorily and keeps falling in 20% or below average, then his case should be placed before the committee for early retirement. There has been a lot of criticism about the promotion policy, but the promotion policy has been very much revamped thanks to the rector who was establishment secretary at that time. And the selection board now consists of 14 senior most officers drawn from different services and different backgrounds, and they are given a standard assessment sheet for marking 10 predefined attributes. The final marks are allocated by 40% for the performance, 30% for the training outcomes, and 30% on the assessment of the board. And that, I think, has been challenged in the court of law, but the court of law has upheld that seniority is not the right way to promote officers. It is the merit and performance which should guide that. So that is a very important achievement which has already been introduced. The other area where we are still trying to struggle is the National Executive Service, because we wanted to bring in everybody who is working in the federal and the provincial governments to compete at the level of grade 19. And when they are at that level, irrespective of the cadre or non-cadre or wherever they were working, they will be recruited for high-level policy-making positions. So we are getting rid of reservations or allocations for different services and open it up for merit-based comparative examination and interviews conducted by the Federal Public Service Commission. In there, we want to further develop expertise within 4 clusters. One is the social sectors, one is the economic sectors, one is general management and technical sectors. And career progression would take place within each of these specialized clusters. I want to share with you my own personal experience, having worked with the government for the last 20 years, that even the generalists from the secretariat group who had no background in finance, when they were concentrating all their service, deputy secretary, section officer, joint secretary, additional secretary in finance or economic matters, they actually had acquired expertise and competence in that field without going through the entire rigmarole of acquiring degrees. I'm a great believer that if you allow them on the job training is very, very critical. And therefore, this clustering will enable people to have specialists in the social sectors, in economic management, in general management, and technical. And the final thing which we are trying to promote, which has yet to take place, is the automation and compensation of civil servants. The switch over from manual to automated processes and the commitment to move towards e-government would also require a look at the skill mix and training requirements of the existing and future civil servants throughout the entire hierarchy. The e-government will itself flatten the hierarchical structure and make apparent the redundancies of the system. Consequently, a lot of clerical and subordinate staff positions can be abolished and they can be utilized in the future government organization, and the savings through the attrition of the surplus staff would be adequate to pay higher compensation packages to the officers and the technical experts. So this is what the approach, and this is what the reform package is and where we stand. There are some which have not yet been implemented, but I hope that they would be implemented over time. Finally, I want to touch upon why these reforms do not pick up the speed or they do not get implemented. Because you may have beautiful plans, beautiful frameworks, but the right answer is whether you have implemented those reforms. Let me give my own few thoughts about it. One of the major instruments in the hands of the political party in power which comes to the government is the frequent use of postings and transfers, arbitrarily exercising excessive discretionary powers. Casual empiricism suggests that when security of tenure is assumed, delivery of services to the citizens, the quality of policy making, and achievement of performance indicators do improve. When an individual knows that he would be in the office for 3 years without any interruption, he or she would be held accountable. But if the average tenure of a secretary of the ministry or a district commissioner varies between 3 to 6 months, the tendency is to blame your predecessors and do not accept any responsibility. Although the Supreme Court has given a verdict on the security of tenure, its guidelines are hardly followed. Thus, the permanent civil service has lost its luster of permanency, as every incoming political party removes the officers they suspect had affiliation and allegiance to their opponents. Loyalty rather than competence or performance have become the dominant considerations in postings and transfers. It is not realized that it is in their interest, in the interest of the political party in power, that they should place the right person on the right job. The individuals thus selected would deliver, and the credit would go to the political party in power, enhancing their chances at the elections. The death of professionalism this way results in poor governance, in dissatisfaction with the ruling party. Second, there is a asymmetry in the accrual of benefits and the incurrence of costs in undertaking reforms. The cost of dislocation and disruption caused by altering the ongoing structure, processes, and evaluation method would be borne by the party that takes the initiative in the short term during its tenure. The losers from these reforms are visible, organized, and would agitate for maintaining their privileges. The benefits are likely to be realized over an extended period of time beyond their tenure of office. The benefits would be diffused, widely spread, and not concentrated in a single cohesive group. So their political opponents at that time who are in power may take the credit for these reforms without having lost their political capital. Hence the reluctance to take such a risk, which makes the party unpopular while their opponents desiring and deriving all the gains. Third, those already in the system have developed vested interests in the existing arrangement. They occupy key policy-making positions and, being closely aligned to the political leaders, make every possible efforts to resist such changes that divest them of their power, perks, and status. If the promotion is carried out on seniority come loyalty, why should they favor a policy that is based on demonstrated performance and effective assessment? Why should they propose an exit and severance policy that may enter upon them at some point of time in the future? Finally, human beings by nature feel satisfied with the status quo, that is, operating in their comfort zone as they know well what is the future going to look like. Change entails uncertainty, unknowns, and imponderables. It is hard to predict or envisage what the future would involve. The mitigating strategy then is to do your best to protect the devil you know, rather than go for a new monster with which you are not familiar. Thank you very much for listening to my submissions, and I'm going to be very happy if there are any questions which I would be able to answer. Thanks very much.
So would I request Professor Lahulo, or would NSG request him to now speak, please?
Yes, you can go ahead. You can go ahead, Prof. Balehudla.
Oh, no. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that illustrious presentation that really shows the span of experience in the public service, including the public service reforms. It's a very difficult act to follow. Let me thank the organizer, the principal of the school, to have invited me to be side by side with you, Professor, and discuss matters of reform. Mine will be a little narrow, picking up on my own experiences as a Director General or Statistician General of South Africa. Probably still the longest serving person in the state at that level, where I presided over the organization for 17 years. And given that sample of one, probably suggesting that longevity does pay, but it pays when you also are innovative, because longevity has its own downsides if you do not innovate. So I will ask that I share my screen, if I'm allowed to share the screen, Principal, that will be fine, and go through this presentation in quick order. Is my screen visible?
Yes, please put it on slide mode. We can see it.
On slide mode, okay, well, that's fine. I'll try and discuss a few things around the importance of civil service. I think my co-presenter has really elaborated on the importance of civil service. I'll try and contextualize the situation in South Africa, because it's necessary to understand how South Africa rose as a civil service, or is a civil service post-apartheid. And then I will try and say what has been the experience in the 3 decades, and what that experiment has meant, and what might rebuilding the state take, and the role of a civil service in modern times. I mean, so one of the reasons why civil service is important, I would really go into Amartya Sen's to argue that the civil service is important because lives of human beings are battered and diminished in all kinds of different ways. And the first task is to acknowledge that deprivations of very different kinds have to be accommodated within a general overarching framework. And that framework is usually provided by a government, that the government has a responsibility towards its citizens to deal with these deprivations of different kinds. And in the case of South Africa, which was emerging out of apartheid, these were very prominent and predominant. And our retired Chief Justice Moseneke, reflecting on this, makes that point, and asks the question, why did we miss it? Why have we not delivered on that mandate? And in this respect, I'll touch on a little bit on how we can use the modern tools of multidimensionality to actually bring business and government together around tools that they can use to resolve the relationship, because the relationship between government and business is very, very blunt. So the state's tools between business, government are very blunt, and they tend not to see one the other and have discussions. For instance, in South Africa, at the onset of COVID, business came with a litany of things, a list of things that they thought could be done. And in the absence of tools of absorbing this on the side of government, also on the side of business, of saying what they are saying may be realizable, it was not possible to even venture into that litany of things that business suggests that could be used. And in many ways, things like multidimensional poverty indices have been useful. I'll not talk about that much. But I'm trying to look at the situation in 1990 when transition was to occur. And this period was influenced largely by Milton Friedman. And in one way, the Overton window of the impossible becoming the inevitable came by with the assistance of Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the idea of a small government, not a small state, but a small government, and the rising power of the private sector found itself at its zenith at the time on the dawn of democracy. And South Africa was in the throes of negotiated settlements. At the same time, China was very unhappy about its backwardness and was exploring ways of advancement. And Milton Friedman also tried his luck in China. So the rise of neoliberalism and privatization came at this point when South Africa was on the verge of finding its feet as a post-apartheid state. And of course, Mikhail Gorbachev was visited by Milton Friedman, and he implemented the shock therapy through the glasnost and the perestroika. And as a consequence of that, in good part, Russia's life expectancy gains reversed, inflation skyrocketed, growth plummeted, living standards collapsed in Russia. And China was looking at this, took note of what was happening at that time, and decided that it will use its own market economy, which is etched in China's ancient traditions. Isabel Weber makes this very important point of how China escaped the therapy. And in this respect, they had this ever-normal granary and using what is heavy to shoot at what is light. Now, taking from what China did in this space, one realizes that professionalizing those who are in charge of change is very, very important. And here the Chinese said you need for empirical assessment of concrete dynamics. And I would like to undergird my discussion on the need for empirical assessment of concrete dynamics. And of course, it's a very important point in South Africa, the extent to which we have used that. Now, in the case of South Africa, on the dawn of democracy, we had this Reconstruction and Development Program, which exalted 5 important points, which is meeting basic needs, developing our human resources, building the economy, democratizing the state and society, and implementing, which would have been the sum total of implementing the RDP. But 3 decades since, we realized that it has been very difficult to implement this. In fact, a critique of where we are now suggests that we have done everything else but implementing the RDP. And so therefore, the approval of cabinet of these reforms is a very much welcome action. 30 years in the history of a country, of a state, however painful it might be, is a very short period of time, and countries have gone through all this. I was just arriving from Addis this morning, where you see the Tigray War taking a lot of toll on what was happening in Ethiopia. So South Africa has been caught in this transition, and in this process of transition and design of policies, we find that the emergence of incentive for petty and mega corruption. For instance, one of the things that South Africa faced in terms of just meeting basic needs is that society at large has been disadvantaged, the Black society, yet the state decided to outsource those functions that the disadvantaged society were actually active in. And this was a clear neoclassical neoliberal process that Milton Friedman, which was the cleaning services were outsourced in the main, where you would have actually done better had you retained these cleaning services in the state. And in that space, you find a revolving door of people who are tendering for cleaning services in government buildings. The municipal services were also outsourced. At universities, it led to very, very chaotic situations. I'm pleased that at the moment, the universities are employing these people on a more permanent basis. I mean, whenever they employ an employee who is disadvantaged as a university, your task as a university is to answer the question, what is the next generation of this person who is waiting for you going to look like? And if we were to cover all that across the state, we would actually answer the development question and use the state as an institution, the government as an institution, and those government tentacles of it to resolve the problem. But if you outsource that to a private sector, they are not concerned about that at all. I mean, my office instead, I say I had to resist this. I had to say the drivers and the cleaners, of course, I lost the battle on cleaners, but the drivers, I said the drivers will be the responsibility of this institution. So what will the rebuilding of the state do? There are these tragedies of the commons that I think we face as countries, as a society, as institutions, between labor and capital. And these are adversarial situations, and they don't have a real solution. Or rather, they don't have a mechanism for being solved. The adversarial nature of this, it makes that the government maximizes taxes, capital maximizes tax loopholes. And here you see the tension between government and the private sector, including where the private sector says, "Oh, government, you misuse our taxes all the time by paying for yourselves heavy salaries." Government maximizes popular support, society maximizes utility of services. And in exchange of popular support, society expects maximization of utilities. And then, of course, capital maximizes profit, and at the same, society maximizes utility. Now, in modern times, in modern economics, in modern societies, how do we actually ensure that we bridge this gap? And here, the MPI that I spoke about enables a way in which this, as an instrument, enables us to try and navigate these very complex situations. Now, I want to go back to South Africa and say, what was the situation like? The Montflair scenario, once the RDP was the express policy of South Africa, side by side with this came the Montflair scenario, which were put up by Shell. These were in the main, they ask the question, will the settlement be negotiated? Is a settlement negotiated? Will it be? Will the transition be rapid? And are the government policies sustainable? That is, If the government policies become populist, we'll be in an Icarus. If the transition is not rapid, there'll be lame duck. And then if the settlement is not negotiated, there'll be an ostrich. So it's captured in these kinds of scenarios. And what we found out is that, yes, the settlement was negotiated. In fact, it was decisive and rapid because after the assassination of Chris Hani, Mandela became the de facto president and declared when the election will be. So these two preconditions were met. Was the macroeconomic policies populist? The shift from what the RDP said to what South Africa adopted at the macroeconomic policy level actually was not populist. The question then is, if all these three conditions were met in the 1994 agreement, why did why was the economic growth and democracy not inclusive? Why was the democracy and growth not inclusive? Because this is what we are dealing with now. So our stance towards macroeconomic, away from what was labeled as macroeconomic populism, landed us into a situation in 2002, where now there was a step change and there was this issue around how do we move towards a different set of scenarios, and the memories of the future were the scenarios that were set. This was a government scenario. The Montflair scenarios were outside government. And in order to execute these scenarios, such as in terms of getting into these four scenarios, the Shosholoza, the Dudisanan, the Skedonk, the Good is Nice, required technical expertise in policy design and policy analysis, which we didn't have in abundance. But there was an ethic amongst that first, second cadre of directors general and the politicians that was focused on saying, we will deliver no matter what. And Nelson Mandela himself said, we came out of the bush, we didn't have engineers, we didn't have all this which apartheid had, but we are determined to win. So here was South Africa that was poised for new opportunities, high economic growth and participation, multilateral wealth thriving in the global economy, and diverse and tolerant society. At this point in time, under Shosholoza, there was even the idea of hosting the World Cup. And by all counts, South Africa was heading into this particular scenario of high economic growth and participation. In fact, during that period, we had a growth of about 6% and sustained growth of average 5%. And sustained here, I mean 4 years, which is not something that one can be proud of and saying sustained, but at least 4 years in succession, South Africa breached the 5% growth and things started happening. So we moved away from what the Montflair scenarios were giving us by tempering the economic policies in particular. So design of policies actually matter, and the profession is very important, particularly in government. Now, things happened. The party was at war with itself, and the transition was not a fine transition, although there was an idea around continuity of change. And then the scenarios that guided us towards 2018 government were the ones that looked at what will happen given these circumstances of a party that is at war with itself. And the scenarios there were not yet Uhuru, Kalakat, and Muvango. And if you look at all these scenarios, they don't suggest a good outcome. I mean, the best of the West would have been Galakata, but all these are the worst case scenarios. So at that point, South Africa was facing a worst case scenario in 2008 after Polowal. And what we saw following this, going forward, was that government no longer discussed scenarios. So the idea of professionalizing the state in terms of managing scenarios had disappeared. I haven't indicated that in all these cases, in the Montflair scenario, the policies were clear, but they were never quantified. Under the Memories of the Future, it was storylines. So was it storylines under the future we chose. These things were not clear policies. There were no clear policies that we said, these policies align with this scenario, let alone being quantified. So by the time we got to this point where government also abandoned scenarios, we had actually failed the first test of saying, what are the policies that will actually deliver this particular scenario? Then, of course, we came with one scenario, which is our future. So in all these processes, you realize that basically the public service was not aligned in terms of capacity to handle a complex machinery such as government. And so our future, the National Development Plan, was not a scenario. It was not designed quantified. It therefore was not a plan. It was a storyline of 380 pages. Now, I want to drift a bit here to go to one of the presenters that came from London School of Economics, who wrote the book, What We Owe Each Other. Here, if you look at how she speaks about Baroness, now the name just disappears, I think it's age. When you look at what she suggests about transitions from one age to the next until retirement, here she looks at the total spending of government across age of people. And here you can see this is spending on education, around 15%. And then, of course, we don't spend a lot for these people who are under 21, but we spend a lot towards pensions and so on. Now, when we look at South Africa in terms of spending on health and spending on education, these amounts here, these quantities here at the lower end are almost about right. Yet we do not get the outcomes that we should be getting in South Africa for a variety of reasons, and large among them, the neoliberal policies that we adopted. So it's not the amount of money that you allocate, but rather the system of policies that should actually help you to achieve the goals you want to achieve. So whatever amount of money we have spent on education and health has not yielded over a 30-year period any results that are great. So if you look at this graph here, or rather this particular one that I'm showing you, here is the graph of white graduates and the black graduates in terms of proportions. So you can see that the whites here are like Korea. Korea has this kind of shape for people who are graduates, and this is black on the right. So there is a big burden here. Despite high expenditure and almost universal attendance of primary school, people don't progress at higher education levels. And ultimately, the net effect of this is that at tertiary, South Africa only moved 9 percentage points to 12% for the black population, whereas amongst whites, they already achieved a lot, 42 to 45%. So as the world becomes a lot more complex, the blacks remain actually outside the system. So are the colors. The people who have progressed well are the Indians and the whites. So when you look at the general populace and the effect of the public service on the general population, it has not been effective amongst the blacks. The changes have been so minimal, and they go and reflect themselves in the positioning of the public service as a weak point. So even a demographic transition in South Africa, actually, you can argue that the demographic transition has occurred. You can see that South Africa is almost sailing with Malaysia, and then Singapore had a very sharp transition. So is South Korea and China. They had a very rapid transition from a position of a population pyramid that is broad-based to one which is almost like a stovepipe. South Africa also has been in that space. But what one wonders is we have not seen or realized the demographic dividend out of that, which all these other Asia tigers have actually realized. We have not realized a demographic dividend. And now that the fertility is very, very low, I'm not encouraging that it should change, but there's not a stock from which we can draw to have another demographic transition out of which we could get a demographic dividend. So South Africa, in terms of policy design, you realize that it really has been producing a toy for the nation every 2.5 years, the RDP, the gear which replaced the RDP right at the beginning, then the NGP, then the ASGISA, which came in about 2004 for another 4 years. We saw this intervention by ASGISA actually changing the fortunes of South Africa. Some say that there was a boom, and then came the NDP, which I've just shown that it wasn't a plan. And then there was the 9-point plan. Now we are having an ERRP and DDM master plans. Sadly, these things have not been undergirded by any sense of professional civil servants who would argue by how much will we move the needle on employment, by how much will the civil service, the government, contribute to the changes in the material conditions of the population. The only document that is available is what was in the Treasury document in February, and I tried to look at it in the MTBPS, but I didn't see it in this MTBPS. But that document says very, very clear things. It says by 2026, unemployment will have risen from 35% to 38%. Growth will be about 1.6% at that time. The question that we have to ask the civil service and government and the private sector and everybody is this the best that we can do under the circumstances? And therefore we have to ask the bigger question, what is the use of government? If unemployment will continue growing 3 decades since, we can't blame that on COVID-19. We can't blame it on the riots in KwaZulu-Natal. We can't blame it on the floods. We were poised for that kind of situation because the policies that we have do not actually generate the kinds of things that we need, the growth that we require or that we deserve. Now, I tried to look at an analysis of where can I pose South Africa on this, and I think this matrix helps a lot because here we are looking at stakeholder satisfaction and stakeholder expectations on this. And here is high stakeholder expectations and low stakeholder expectations. This side is high satisfaction level and low satisfaction level. Now, these quadrants require specific actions. When stakeholder expectations are low and stakeholder satisfaction is low, or everything that falls in here, you must drop it. It's not priority. If stakeholder expectations are high and satisfaction is high and stakeholder expectations are not that high or low, this is where you innovate. This is where you should innovate. And I used to use this matrix quite a lot to innovate in this space. And then here where stakeholder satisfaction is high and the stakeholders' expectation is high, you maintain. And here where stakeholder expectations are high and level of satisfaction is low, you actually have to deal with this as priority. When you do this analysis on South Africa, there's nothing that falls here, that falls in there. I think a lot will have to fall in here, but everything else is priority. And once everything is priority, then you are a country in crisis. And once you're a country in crisis, then you have a very serious problem. And if your civil service is not liberated in the way that the reforms suggest now, after a long time of dereliction of duty, this crisis poses an existential threat to society. So if we look at energy, if we look at decent jobs, economic growth, on the socio-economic transformation agenda, we actually score very low because everything is in this quadrant of crisis. If you think about performance on the party is in crisis itself. And then, of course, when you think about those things that bring evidence that help you to plan. All these things are in crisis because the planning, the policy development, if you look at the list of plans, 10 of them over 30 years, a toy for the nation every 3 years. You see that there is actually no direction, and that direction has to be set by the civil service. Now, when you look at things like construction, education, the levers of growth, such as the industries, construction is in the doldrums, education, transport. When you look at those 9, it's really showing a serious crisis. Nothing is in this space, except agriculture, which has shown some growth. Now, we have the Zondo Commission report. It has been released. If the recommendations, of course, they may not be binding, they are not binding, but the moral and ethical standard is that they should be binding. And if we don't go by that moral and ethical standard of those recommendations as binding, we actually are going to have a serious crisis. If we move and say they are binding on a moral and ethical basis, although legally they may not, then we may win the war of this crisis that we are in. So what really we have in terms of business process and stakeholder management and engagement, we really are in a country in a crisis. And the changes that government has implemented on civil service reforms certainly are a necessary step in the right direction and should take us far. So I just want to now move and towards the end and go into the insular scenarios, which were not in the constructed by government. We had 2 scenarios that were constructed by government. One was by Shell in 1992, 2 in the middle, in the second and third, in the second and third administration were within government. Then all scenarios were no longer part of our rubric as civil service. The implemented scenarios were created by a few of us under implemented trust. And we got these 3 scenarios, Isibujwa, Gwara Gwara, Naila Walk, and we are actually in a Gwara Gwara state. And this red here describes what this state is. It's a nation torn between immobility and restless energy, as you could see in that assessment of the quadrants. And we are arguing that if the recovery policy framework augments the post-1996, which is the settlement of 1996, the year, then we actually are going on a path of immiserizing growth. Now, these are things that the civil service require to master in order to understand what are the set of policies that will make us move away from the Gwara Gwara scenario and move towards a Naila walk. So this red here explains the nature of the scenario, what the end state in the scenario will be. And this part says, what are the policies? The good thing about the implemented scenarios is that they have been quantified. And in the quantification, you crystallize what then is possible outcome. Unfortunately, even in the minister's budget speech, of course, you would say it's not expected, but if the scenarios were quantified, the minister would have to say, by this year, we'll have grown the jobs by so much. But the minister's speech is a set of inputs without talking about impact. And then, of course, the departments will come with their inputs individually. There's no aggregation of impacts. Therefore, there's no system in government that enables and say that civil service is truly professional. In the absence of that, things can be. So I don't want to talk about, so we are in a very serious state here, and that Gwara Gwara state has deepened from where we were in 2019 to 2020, and in 2021, where really things are terrible in South Africa. We are in that Gwara Gwara state of restlessness up to 59%. So as a chief statistician, for years I've been there, my sort of approach was that, and I copied this from South Korea, well in 2001 when I was there. I said, this model of Korea that talks to the role of the statistical authority in relation to the planning authority, in relation to the top authority, is very, very crucial. Unfortunately, we lacked this stomach that digests. And even if it digests, it's influenced a lot more by the resource authority. It carries, the resource authority carries an undue weight in the planning process. And therefore, the other line departments like mining, agriculture, and so on, where growth would have to emerge from, are more or less very junior in terms of articulating and managing the planning function in the state. And I think that's where we need to strengthen our economic planning, our social planning, using tools so that we can make decisions around how we look at markets. In developed countries, they use their pensions to generate assets to address things like ESCOM, to address electricity and so on. In emerging markets, we actually go for sovereign debt. Yet South Africa, of course, it's here, but it has pensions, and we are not using those. And I think in terms of these kind of articulations, it should be possible for South Africa to go on its pensions. And of course, the minister in the Treasury said they will take on the debt. But that debt should have been taken on that basis right at the beginning of ESCOM and all other debt, but managed well and not diluted by corruption. So when we look at evidence, we really need to inspect this evidence so that it provides to us raw level intelligence. But when you start modeling, then you get second level intelligence, which is the input, output, supply, and so on. But at the top of this, you actually need modeling using the evidence in order to professionalize the state. What do I conclude? My conclusion is we need to stick to creation of scenarios, because on the basis of that, we can mobilize a national agenda. We need to translate those scenarios into policies, because policies provide clarity. We need to quantify scenarios because they actually matter. Quantification give you sound choices that can be made, and you can exact accountability by making those choices. And for the building of capacity in public policy, we need to embed scenarios. We need to get this capability for consistency of foresight. Therefore, capacitating the state functionaries is very important if scenario design, economic quantification through tools of foresight and choices. And this should improve the quality of policy choices. Well, I'm not advertising, but you want to ask what can be done. We have created Economic Modeling Academy, which provides the tools that I'm talking about, which has used StatSA data over a period of 20 years or a period of 30 years, and that's how those models have been built. They are working on a web-enabled platform, so people can go in there and get trained on policy design, which includes macro-micro linked models, which include province, district, municipality, and that macro-micro intersects with the effects of the policy design on the province, district, municipality, consistent with the national policies. And it provides the basis for discourse to anticipate what the policy designs may actually deliver, but also allows for revision and all those kinds of things. In the absence of these tools, I'm afraid we are groping in the dark. I thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Professor Lebotla. Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein. our esteemed guests. So we're going to have a conversation, a question and discussion. Let me firstly encourage everyone who'd like to and who can to feel free to type some of your questions, because I'm going to start with those questions that have been posted, and then I'll give the panelists an opportunity to respond, and then we'll give the rest of the guests who are here an opportunity to ask questions. So I hope that we have seen through the implications of this conversation across both the South African case study and also the Pakistani case study. Now, I just want to assist everyone who's here to crystallize this conversation on building this capable state between what is happening in Pakistan and also what is happening in South Africa. I'm going to use Dr. Hussein's latest book titled Governing the Ungovernable. And I just want to read out a very interesting quote from that book, where Dr. Hussein quotes one of the esteemed scholars, I.A. Rahman. And the quote goes as follows, open quote. In a stable democracy, fair elections produce a change only at the top, whilst the rest of the system does not suffer a personnel change. In an unstable state, elections are not fair, and the result is a change of personnel along the line. Department heads are changed, DPOs are replaced, heads of media organizations are changed, and above all, the Kabza groups and commission agents that manipulate the sale of land and construction of plazas are replaced. Institutions, and this is the most important part, institutions are handed over to good-for-nothing individuals, merit is derided, and psychopathy is rewarded, close quote. So many of us who've not yet read that book, I would encourage you to read Dr. Hussein's book titled Governing the Ungovernable, especially many of us from South Africa. We might learn one or two things. Now, there are a number of questions already that have been posted. Some of them we've had some responses to. Others are addressed to you, Dr. Hussein. Some of the questions are addressed to Professor Lahota. The first question, Dr. Hussein, starts with a bit of a statement. So the statement is as follows. In nations like Pakistan and South Africa, there is a renewed interest in reforming governance and civil service as a result of mounting criticism that undermining countries' economic, social, and political development, because public officials are less able to keep up with the new challenges. Both nations, meaning South Africa and Pakistan, have made several attempts to restructure the public service, but there is a broad perception that these reforms have failed to significantly last long and success is not happening. Is this impression correct? This is to you, Dr. Hussein. The second question comes from Salim, and Salim is asking, from the Pakistan Audit and Accounts Service, that's where Salim is based. This is a very informative session. Thank you very much, Salim. I want to ask, what is the performance evaluation mechanisms of the bureaucracy in the government of South Africa? This is to you, Professor Lahota. Are there any prospects of switching towards some sort of automation in performance evaluation in South Africa? The third question comes from Ghazi to Dr. Hussein. And then Ghazi starts by pointing out that you very rightly pointed out that government should not be in the business, rather than the government should provide an enabling environment to provide a case to private sector to flourish. why, despite theoretical and empirical facts in Pakistan, the government is still sticking as a provider of goods and services ranging from procurement to agri-products, that manufacturing and services then causing skewed allocation. It's a bit muddled up, but I hope that Dr. Hussein, you got the gist of it. Really, it's about government providing the enabling conditions instead of government being active in the business of running various sectors. The next one is also for you, Dr. Hussein, from
sorry for interjection. May I make a suggestion? Could we let Dr. Ishtar Hussain and Professor Lahulu answer these questions before we move to the next questions? If that's all right.
That's okay. You can go ahead.
All right. Thank you.
You go ahead, Professor Hussein. I'll come up.
Let me attempt to offer my own comments. As I said in my last, set of remarks, that there are political economy constraints. And these political economy constraints transcend the political change. So you may have one political party in power, the second or the third, but the basic structure remains unchanged. Some cosmetic changes take place here and there because those whose interests, political interests, coincide and converge with the kind of civil servants they have, do not allow any major restructuring to take place. And that, I think, unless that convergence of interest for somehow or the other is disconnected, I do not think there will be some major achievements in this game. Now, the government should not be in the business. My submission is that if you look at the subsidies which were being given to the nationalized commercial banks in Pakistan till 1973 to 2005, they were not only creating fiscal deficits, but they were depriving the common citizens from getting allocations for education, health, drinking water supply. But since we privatized these banks, they are generating billions of rupees as taxes, which are adding to your fiscal revenues. And therefore, when you have people who have no skin in the game running the businesses, they don't care whether it is profit or loss. But when you have people who have stakes in the business, they make sure that there are efficiencies, there is no waste, there is no corruption, there is no leakage, and therefore the general welfare of the people do change. We would not have been able to give, 16 million households the kind of cash assistance in the COVID-19 if we had to give these subsidies like I spelled out. Because we were able to get rid of those subsidies and the taxation really went up from the corporate sector, we were able to provide cash assistance to the poorest of the poor. So I personally think that the bargain is that the private sector should be taxed completely while the government should try to provide a competitive marketplace for them to compete with each other.
Professor Lahutla?
Yes, the assessment of public service, can it be automated? I'm sure it can. But the automation starts from basically how you automate the work itself. Because while you may intervene, because automation may not resolve everything, but at least it standardizes the nature of evidence that is presented before you. And let me share my own experience at Stats SA, where by introducing project management in the system throughout, it enabled us to actually connect inputs to outputs, to budgets, to everything. And we developed this system over a long period of time. So one of the things that then used to happen was that oftentimes I would find myself forced to go and release the results on the date that I've agreed to. But because I was I was concerned about how well can we put all these results together in order that they make meaning to the nation. You know, as a statistician, you release the consumer price index, you release national accounts, you release all this individually. And people who are working in those spaces feel the pressure for performance. Then I often had to talk to them and say, look, we need to raise the value of what all of this actually means, rather than release them individually. Of course, we can put everything on the web, but I need to assemble everything in my head. And in time, I realized that I was delaying the releases. The point I'm making is by adopting a project management system, forced performance throughout the organization, but also forced a different thought around the effectiveness of the releases of the recipients, or how well will the reports be received. Now, there is another part of that I think has to be taken into account. And my experience here again is around service delivery to society. What do they think about services? So the province of KwaZulu-Natal approached us, said, well, we want you to come and run this survey. And I argued that I can't run a survey for one province. All the time, whenever I run something, it must be for the nation, so that I don't bring information asymmetries in the market of statistics. Because, but KwaZulu-Natal said, okay, if you do not want to come, we'll do it ourselves. And I knew that they'll mess it up, so I had to go. The other provinces, I went to them, and this political information interface is very crucial. The premiers refused. They said they don't have money. But the main reason was because the election was around the corner. KwaZulu-Natal has insisted on getting that survey done every 2 years in order to understand and appreciate how citizens feel about what is being provided. And one of the things that came out very clear, it shows that we as government are not at all coordinated in our service delivery, given the dispersed levels of satisfaction, the dispersal of satisfaction across different terrains of delivery, which in the main satisfaction should circulate around the same area. Toilets satisfied lowly, houses satisfied lowly, electricity. So when you think about human settlements in the way it is, we know it's something called human settlements. And by human settlements, you mean that the abolition, the electricity, the water, all those represents a human settlement, a functioning human settlement. When you see the level of satisfaction spread across in the way it does, that represents less of a human settlement.
Thank you. So we're going to open up the session to the rest of the participants who are here to be able to ask questions. As we do that, just for the two guests to think about these two issues that have been raised in writing. The one issue, and both guests would need to think about this, the question that is being asked, and I think it's an important question because it's very easy for us to get absorbed into a lot of things and we lose sight of the most critical issues that lie ahead. So the question is, what are three most important ingredients of a successful civil service reform. If you were to be forced to think about only 3 most critical ingredients of successful civil service reform, that's the first question that I'd like our panelists to think about as we open up the session. The second one is about trust, and it applies both to Pakistan and to South Africa. How can the state be able to regain the trust of the citizens? What are the things that the state will need to do to regain the trust of the citizens? As we're thinking about those two, I would like to open it up. We have 2 classrooms. We have an NMC classroom that is full, that is connecting with us virtually. We also have an MC classroom that is also full and connecting with us virtually. You must also feel free to ask your questions directly. So we're going to open it up.
So just by way of clarification, some of the questions that you're reading coming from the Pakistani side are being asked by the people sitting in those 2 classrooms.
Yes.
So the one you just read, for example, from Zafar Iqbal Khan, he is sitting in NMC here in Lahore. So they're already asking questions, and as we agreed yesterday, they will just type in, and I will read the questions, and you will read the questions from South African side. But it doesn't matter; we are both reading, as long as the questions are getting across to the speakers. Only one point, because we are overrunning in terms of time, and Dr. Ishrat has traveled from Karachi, and he has to take a flight back. So we'll have to cut short the questions from 50 minutes down to 35, which means 3:05. So just to reiterate the question which you just read, and handing over to Dr. Ishrat and then Professor Lahula, the one question you said was from Zafar Iqbal Khan was, what are 3 most important ingredients of a successful civil service reform? And why civil service is not coming up with the expectation of the masses? And maybe with your permission, I could read another from Mr. Tayyab Ali, which is somewhat related and applies both to, I think, South Africa and Pakistan, is what is the role of international organizations like IMF, World Bank in reform of civil service in South Africa and Pakistan? So whichever of the 2 honorable speakers would like to speak first, please.
Let me attempt to answer both these questions. The 3 important ingredients of a civil service which is efficient and successful is that you induct people on the basis of merit and competence through a comparative process. No political appointments at any level. The second, you must distinguish between good performers and the bad performers and reward those who are doing well and penalize those who are not doing well. And third, that you should give them opportunities to excel themselves by continuous learning and acquiring knowledge in order to cope up with the complex problems we are facing. In my view, these are the 3 most essential ingredients. And my work on East Asia, when I was the chief economist of the World Bank, shows that this is exactly how the civil service in East Asia has shaped itself. And China's entire bureaucracy is based on merit. And all the promotions from the town and villages to the Politburo and the People's Congress are based on the performance. And those who are not satisfactory, they are sent to the oblivion. So I think these are practical examples which I can quote. As far as the role of international organization is concerned, we are better off if we keep them away, because they are not so familiar with the social, political, legal problems and cultural problems of the country. Their knowledge is very superficial, and it's only the people within the country who can look at the examples of the other developing countries and imbibe them in their own analysis and their own prescriptions. But I would not like the international organization to meddle in the civil service reforms, because it itself is a very difficult task to sell. And when it is being sold under the aegis of IMF and the World Bank, the resistance against those reforms becomes even more intense. And you can be assured that these reforms will never be implemented. Now, how can the state regain the trust of the citizens? Worldwide experience shows that if you devolve the powers, resources to the local governments, and they get a sense of participation in the decision making and monitoring what is really happening, this trust is established. But when you have taxes collected from these communities disappearing in a black box, which they don't know what is being used for, there is a deficit of trust. So the best thing to do is to empower and delegate powers of ordinary citizens' day-to-day life to the local governments who should be elected by the people of those communities.
Professor Lahula, do you have something to add to this, please?
Yes, I think I agree with what Professor Said has said about the three most important. I mean, an empowered civil service that knows what it does really yields results. In my tenure as statistician general in Statistics South Africa, I actually created opportunities for learning, including a program with one university, Stellenbosch, which brought a new dimension in the knowledge space of statistics, which is geography. And that was a very important aspect that was deficient in many statisticians. And that increased the value of not only visibility, but application of statistics. On the question of trust, certainly trust is built. If it's lost, it gallops, and it's very difficult to regain it. In the memories of the future, in the scenarios, one of the advices that emerged out of those scenarios, and I'll encourage us to go and read them, is the prediction, the precision with which the prediction was made on that scenario of Muvango. And the solutions are a lot more it's said in the scenarios which were written in 2008. The ANC comes to society and says it is truly sorry. Then that's the beginning of rebuilding trust. But what we see at the moment in the ruling party, there isn't a concerted effort emanating from itself around truly being sorry. So when trust is broken, it can only be rebuilt when people are honest about what they think and how they act. The incoherence of actions and articulations cannot build trust. And I think South Africa, where we are now, we are in that inconsistency of articulations. International organizations, South Africa imposed its own austerity measures and avoiding the IMF and the World Bank. The farther away they are from us, the better. But unfortunately, we have invited them on our shores. And I'm sure we are going to have a lot of more problems going forward. They don't know the culture, they don't know the environment, they impose things. If you think about education in Africa and the results of education through the structural adjustments, in their own admission, the World Bank and the IMF say, well, they made a mistake in the 80s, but damage has been done. Thanks.
May I read the next question, please?
Yes, go ahead.
So there is Abraham Odafan Dominic. The question is for Dr. Rashid Hussain Saab. How can you measure qualitative performance elements through objective criteria of performance indicators focusing on individual factors?
This is a very interesting, question which is posed. The quality has also indicators. If you go to a business enterprise, they have this total quality measurement. So there are ways of measuring quality also. But the most important thing in a civil service performance evaluation is the dialogue between the officer and the supervisor as to what the expectations of the supervisor are, whether they are measurable, verifiable, quantifiable, or whether they are qualitative. Once you have that agreement, then you can design those indicators which are acceptable to both the officer. So it's a result of a dialogue between the officer. It is not a one-way street where the supervisor says, well, you have to do this, and they have to sign, both of them, on this. And this has happened. I mean, we have been running these kind of performance evaluation in the central bank for last 15 years. And there have been all the bugs which were initially, appeared, they were all taken care of. So as you practice, as you implement, you find out that that really gives you a lot of understanding and insight whereby some of these reservations can be addressed.
What I found a lot in these evaluation systems, which are individually focused, they have to be complemented by team evaluation so that people can still work together, because there is always some animosity that emerges. Of course, one has to preside over this animosity of saying, well, I was a 70, I don't think I'm 65, particularly if there are financial rewards right at the end. I think a system of rewards that allocate team effort, team projects, team whatever you, as a reward to a team brings a lot more harmony. Yes, but individual performance is important. It has to be assessed. 360-degree is very, very crucial in those cases, so that it mitigates the acrimony that may emerge out of a one-way evaluation. 360, I think, is very important. And the scheme of rewards need not be only monetary. It should be probably something that enhances teamwork, getting a new project to run and so on.
Wonderful. Mr. Waraj, with the time constraints that we are having, I am suggesting that we then we move towards closure, and we allow Dr. Munir to give us a vote of thanks. From your side, I hand over to you.
We can take one or two questions. We can take two more questions. Sir.
We can take more than two questions. We have another 15 to 20 minutes to
All right. So I saw in the chat room a question from the principal NSG. If you have read it, maybe you can take that question. From the principal NSG, there was a question. Can you read it? I think it said, briefly it appeared, it said, what is the role of the civil services in Pakistan?
Okay. I mean, the size of the civil service in Pakistan, both elected and appointed officials. And maybe the second question is, here in South Africa, most of the feedback we have received as we were working on the professionalization framework was that members of the public were asking whether we will also seek to professionalize politicians as well, those who are elected into political office. What is the experience in Pakistan? If myself, I get into a political position, are the minimum requirements, whether yes or no, once I'm in a position, am I expected to go through formal training and development once I'm in the office? Thank you.
The size of the civil service in Pakistan at the federal and the provincial government is 3 million, which means 5% of the civilian labor force. So it's not a very big, burden on the state to that extent. And that includes all the autonomous bodies and corporations and state-owned companies. The other question which you have is what the role is. The role is that the all Pakistan service officers start their career at the district level or the subdivisional level, and then they come to the secretariat in the provincial government and subsequently to the federal government and rise to become the permanent secretaries. That is the career path, and that is the role they play. As far as the professionalization of political leaders is concerned, in the last cabinet, we got an approval for appointing technical advisors to all the ministers who were in charge of the technical ministry. So if you have in charge of the power ministry, you should have a professional expert in power who would be advising you as the minister. The second, there is a Pakistan Institute of Parliamentary Affairs, which holds seminars and very many learning, exercises for the parliamentarians. But I'm afraid that the impact has not been that great, in my opinion. You want to say it?
So maybe two more questions. One is really related to the juxtaposition between what we want to do and the unintended consequences of the things that we want to do. So Ali Raza, for example, asks, the concept of job security, this whole concept of security of tenure, he says it has fostered a culture of lethargy. So there is a culture of lethargy that comes with job security. How do we balance these opposing requirements?
I think that's a very pertinent question. Let me offer my own views on this. If you have the performance objectives for each year, and you have the KPIs to measure those performance agreements, then the lethargy element will be minimized. I don't say it will be absolutely, eliminated, but when you have comparative rankings that all the deputy commissioners are going to be evaluated on the basis of the 360 degrees feedback from their own people, whether they have been responsive to the needs of their citizens or not, that really provides you a signal that if you are not actually doing your job, then it is reflected in your performance. And you can remove that individual. I'm not saying that everybody should stick to the 3 years, but if there's somebody who's not performing, you give them a warning and then counseling, and then if they still don't perform, you can move them away. But why I'm in favor of the security of tenure is at the moment, these frequent rotations do not allow either to gain the domain expertise in that particular field or be held accountable. Because if you have 4 secretaries of the government in each division in 1 year, everybody is passing on the buck to the other and not being held accountable. So both for accountability purposes and domain expertise, it is essential that we have security of tenure. But that is not sacrosanct. If they do not come up to the standards of performance, they can be moved. And that's the Supreme Court's decision also. You reduce in writing as to why you are moving them before they complete the tenure. And that is a right they can challenge in the court of law. So the court of law says you have been removed wrongly, then that is the prerogative of the individual to go and appeal to the Supreme Court or whatever it is. So you have a justiciable right for security of tenure too.
I would argue that appointing on the basis that permanency may generate lethargy is avoiding the key issue around what services should be provided. And unfortunately, in South Africa, we had seen that becoming the objective, that will appoint you for 3 years. After all, then you will be there for another 1 year, 2 years, and then you are gone, and then somebody else comes in. So that by design generates a lethargic culture, because the people who are supervising no longer manage performance, but they manage exits. And we have seen that evolving now. So by design, it has that very, very negative impact of a system that has to be, it generates a wrong loyalty frame. You become loyal to your boss instead of loyal to the service that you have to provide. So long-term arrangements for appointment is very important. Of course, I was on a 3-year, 5-year, 1-year contract, but each day I went to office, I was acting in a way that I am there the next day. I never had a possibility of saying I'm not going to be there the next day, whatever the circumstances were. And I think when you are on a long-term possibility, then that longevity provides good performance and good ethics. Thanks.
Yeah, if I may ask another question to the colleagues in Pakistan, do permanent secretaries or heads of department, or DGs as we call them in South Africa, do they have a voice? Do they have agency? You know, how do they engage with the executive, with the prime minister, with the president? Is there a formal system that is present that you use for them to engage? And last question is, in the institutes of government that are here today, do you have a formal relationships with universities such that when there's a training requirement in the state and you don't have the capacity to deliver on that, you can draw on the expertise from higher education, as we are doing as a National School of Government? We've got formal relationships with 10 universities. If the client department wants us to provide training that we have no expertise on, we can then draw on any of the 10 universities to deliver that kind of training. Is that your experience as well? Or if there's a need for providing training on scenario planning, you will go and employ or hire someone to provide the training, or you work with a university to do so? Thank you.
Well, let me answer the last question first. I think you are more successful than we are. We had introduced a very flexible system of hiring consultants. It used to take a long time in order to hire consultants from the academia or from private sector or from others. And we decided that we will simplify it. One of our provinces, Punjab, has a more flexible way of hiring consultants, and we introduced that in the federal government. But there is a problem that our university professors, and I have been a dean of a business school for 8 years, are too much involved in publishing papers in the peer-reviewed journals rather than addressing the socioeconomic problems of the country. Therefore, their knowledge, as far as our problems are concerned, is highly superficial. That's not an in-depth expertise they can bring to the table. And therefore, we have to go and tap either the foreigners or in the private sector who can help us. But it's a very pertinent question, because nobody in the civil service would have all the knowledge in this very complex world of today. So we have to supplement it. And I think That is what we want to do it. And this continuous learning process where you come after 10 years, 15 years, 20 years for training and recharging your batteries, they also invite, for example, the NMC invites the experts to address and to interact with the civil servants. On the first question, the previous Prime Minister had entered into performance agreements with the ministers, his cabinet members. And the ministers actually were reliant upon what the permanent secretaries had proposed, because they are the principal accounting officer and they are the executing officers. So in fact, the performance agreements are agreements between the Prime Minister and the permanent secretaries. And that is what was happening a year ago. I don't know what is happening now, but this was the beginning of this process.
I'll just like to add here that as far as your question is concerned, the federal secretaries and the head of the departments, they have a continuous interaction with the Prime Minister, at least. And in the provincial, at the provincial level, the secretaries or head of the departments, they regularly interact with the chief ministers here. One forum is the cabinet, basically. Every week there's a cabinet meeting, and all the secretaries go to the cabinet and present the cases to the cabinet. And it is the secretaries who have to defend the cases which are to be placed before the cabinet for the decision. So there's a continuous interaction between the federal secretaries and head of the various organizations and the federal ministers and the Prime Minister. So it's a very vibrant and robust mechanism that is in place. And here, as Dr. Ishrat has said, that we regularly at National School of Public Policy and other various training institutes other than the NSPP, we regularly call the academic staff, academia from universities to deliver lectures here. We hold panel discussions with them on various subjects. They are called as experts on economics, on foreign affairs, on finance, financial management, everything, all subjects. Over the 18 weeks that we have a long course here, almost all relevant subjects of for public policy and public service delivery, they regularly come here and interact with the participants and deliver lectures here.
Thank you very much. Mr. Waraj, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. For the formal vote of thanks, I would now request Dr. Ejaz Munir, the Rector of the National School of Public Policy. Dr. Ejaz Munir, of course, is a very senior civil servant. He has about 32 years of career in public service, and he held key administrative and leadership positions, including the Federal Secretary Establishment Division, Aviation Division. In addition, he was also Chief Secretary, Government of Azad Jammu and Kashmir, and Additional Secretary in the Prime Minister's Office. Before that, he headed 6 provincial departments as Secretary to the Government of Punjab, including that of Services and General Administration, Health, Agriculture, Higher Education, Labor and Population Welfare. Before that, he served in the field in senior administrative positions as Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, Assistant Commissioner, and has served also served in Balochistan. He has been instrumental in initiating, finalizing, and implementing several important policy reforms concerning human resource management, training, and capacity building. He holds a master's degree in business administration from the Imperial College of Science and Technology and Medicine, London, along with an MBBS from the foremost medical college here in Pakistan, the King Edward Medical College. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for such a nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be sitting here and delivering a vote of thanks on the completion of this reform on civil services, which is based on the lessons learned from Pakistan and South Africa. It has been organized with joint collaboration of National School of Government, South Africa, and the National School of Public Policy, Pakistan. I would like to thank distinguished speakers, Mr. Pauli Lehola and Dr. Ishrat Hussain, for giving us their invaluable insights for improving civil service with the integration of change, for bringing professionalism in civil servants. I must add here that I had the privilege to work with Dr. Ishrat Hussain for the last 3 years. So it's been, we worked together when he was heading a task force and I was Secretary Establishment Division, and we worked on a large number of reforms. And I'm very happy to say that we were successful in achieving a few of them, and work is being done on the rest. The Executive Development Institute here, which has organized this thing on behalf of NSPP, is a very dynamic institute, and it's is consistently making efforts to bring together the public and private sector at the same forum to exchange ideas on issues which are relevant to the country, and capacity building and training of the academia and the public and private sector officers. So I am also very grateful to Dr. Professor Bhusani because this seminar was his idea when I visited South Africa, and I'm very glad with his persistent efforts. We have been able to organize it within a span of 2 months, and I look forward to further collaboration with you. And I'm also glad to inform you that our MOU has progressed a lot, and I think very shortly we'll be ready to sign it. So that's a good development that's happening. I personally believe this NSG and NSPP, they are making best efforts for the training on the issues related to public policy and civil service reforms. And I would also say that we are living in an era where the global world is bringing enormous opportunities to work together to find solutions with collaborated efforts. This will not only bring learning opportunities from the successful experience of each other, but also foster friendly relationships between the countries. These days, international relations are the hallmark of finding solutions to common problems by incorporating successful ideas for eliminating the flaws in the systems. We all know that a strong civil service is the backbone of any country, being responsible for delivering services at the optimal level to its citizens. The progress of any country is dependent on the well-being of its citizens, and we know that traditional approaches to running operations are helpful for setting such foundations. It's the institutions like NSG and NSPP which are playing a crucial role in drawing the attention of the policy circles and decision makers to work in the capacity building of officers in offering the best services to citizens. I'd like to appreciate the Dean, Director, and all team members of EDI for the efforts to make this event a success and to learn from each other. I would also extend my thanks to the team of NSG who have coordinated the webinar. EDI is an integral unit of the NSPP, and it is working on more outreach programs and has been actively involved in developing liaison with international institutions. We have of late been working in collaboration with France, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and now the South Africa. So we are almost, there are other institutions in Singapore also, where we are planning to arrange training for our staff. So I believe that such collaborations will be an ongoing learning corridor for bridging the knowledge gaps in order to work more optimally while effectively managing change and bringing reforms in the civil services. I once again thank you, the guest speakers, and Professor Bhusani. I really appreciate the collaboration done by the National School of Government, South Africa. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Munir. Can we all switch on our cameras? Professor Lehotla, Can we all switch on our cameras to take a photo, please? This is quite a momentous occasion. Would like to remember it for a long time to come. So Professor Lehotla and everybody else who is on the panel, if we can keep our cameras on for a second, please.
I think I'm there, Dr. Masha.
There we go.
Oh, you can't you see me?
No, I can see you now. Thank you very much.
I see. Oh, I see. I left it on,
Thank you.
not in the best attire, but I couldn't manage to go and change what I had.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the session. From my side, I would like to express my appreciation to everybody, to the panelists, to the participants. This is a series of masterclasses that we've been running with a number of partners. Today, it has been a successful one with our counterparts from Pakistan. From my side, thank you very much. I'm going to give you, Mr. Waraj, an opportunity to then close, and then we can close the session.
Thank you very much. And we were very glad that our first collaboration was such a huge success. And so much interest has been shown in this. And Dr. Ishrat Sen and Professor Lahulu took out their time to share their knowledge with both our Pakistani and South African participants. Thank you very much. And good afternoon and goodbye from our side.
Good afternoon. Goodbye, everyone. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. I can now go and check in. Yeah.